Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us for a very special edition here on the JS Mindset. My name is Denny, and today is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2019. We are absolutely delighted to be sharing the platform today with an investigative journalist and a living legend in the literary world. In addition to Jim Sinclair and Bill Holter, joining us is a very special guest, G. Edward Griffin, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, a now classic investigative book written on the origins of the Federal Reserve. There are few authors in this world who have the ability to do deep dive-like research for their writings. Edward Griffin is one of those writers, and I've heard him compared to the late James Michener, who wrote fictional family stories of certain geographical regions where he backed up his wonderful stories with just solid research. However, in The Creature from Jekyll Island, Ed Griffin doesn't write about fictional characters. He writes about real, live people who lived and breathed and connived and bribed and literally stole the solid foundation of our finances in the United States from the American people. The research in his book is impeccable, and it dismantles piece by piece, layer by layer, the mainstream theory that the Federal Reserve serves and stabilizes the American financial world. Nothing could be further from the truth. So we're delighted to have you, Ed Griffin, and welcome to JS Mindset.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure. It's one of my favorite topics.
Well, I bet it. All right, Ed. The way you wrote the book is incredible to me. You sort of sucked us all into this historical mystery surrounding the beginning of the Federal Reserve that took place over 100 years ago. But how did you get hooked onto this story and begin to research the secrecy and genesis of the Federal Reserve banking system?
Well, that's kind of a boring story, actually. It's like so many things in life that are very important. They didn't start out to be important. You didn't realize where you were headed when you started. That's the way it was with me. It was way back in the late 1960s. I was producing some very low-budget documentary films. And in fact, we didn't even call them documentary films. We called them film strips in those days, where a speaker stands up in front of a crowd and he's giving his lecture. It's like a PowerPoint, but we're projecting the images on the screen, and then there was a beep, and then the operator would advance the picture to the next picture. And it was very crude, but that's what I was doing, and I decided I wanted to produce a documentary on the nature of inflation or the origin of inflation. And so I started to do my research on that, and of course that leads directly to the engine of inflation, which is the Federal Reserve System. And so I had this couple of banker boxes full of research material getting ready to roll. Never did produce the film because I got sidetracked on other things that seemed to be more urgent at the time. But that was how it started. And so I had all this research, and I'd read quite a few books and reports, and I'd interviewed people. Never thought I would do anything with it until finally one day a little group in Pasadena asked me to give a speech, if I would, on the topic of taxes. And I said, well, I don't know anything about taxes except that they're too high, and I'm against them, or something like that. I said, but I could talk to you maybe, to your group, about that hidden tax, and left it there. And the lady said, what's the hidden tax? I said, well, inflation. That's a hidden tax. I mean, everybody pays it, and they don't know where it goes, but they have no choice. They pay it whether they want to or not, and it's tax. Oh, well, we'd like to hear about that, and so I gave a speech on that. And it was pretty successfully received. I mean, everybody said, you put that on the road. You should do that. Well, you never tell an aspiring public speaker to put something on the road because he'll do it. And so I did. I said, okay, if people like this talk, and I thought it was extremely important, I prepared something called, it was called a reality course or a crash course on money. And it was a one-day seminar, and I put it on the road and did that for about a year, and it was very well received. But then I became embarrassed because people were asking me questions about, well, Mr. Griffin, if this is true and we're heading into these problems and the money is disappearing in its purchasing power, what should I do? Well, how should I invest my money? How do I protect myself? And that's what I knew that I was a fraud, because I had no idea how to answer those questions. I didn't really know anything about the real markets out there, investments or anything like that. All I knew is that there were a bunch of crooks stealing our money through the banking system. So I quit doing the seminars, and I enrolled in what's called the College for Financial Planning, which is a a correspondence course that everybody takes. It's kind of like a CPA course, except you come out with a certificate that says you're now a financial planner. Well, I didn't really want to be a financial planner, but I thought that would be the best way for me to learn about the real world of markets. So I did that, and then I realized, oh my gosh, I had a better grasp of the story, and I thought, this is bigger than I thought. So that's when I decided to write a book. Okay, and I started to write a book, and it was the whole process was probably about a 7-year process from start to finish. So that's the boring story. I just went from one thing to the next and learned as I went, actually. And I came out at the end of it realizing, even though in the beginning when I was giving these seminars, I really was quite ill-informed. I didn't have the whole picture yet. So, and I probably still don't. That's the thing about these complex topics. You can live within a story your whole life and never really know all of the aspects of it.
You're going to be self-deprecating, I can see that, but I'm going to tell you that anybody who can pass the CFP course as it is now, I took that course, it was a 6-hour exam. I don't know what it was back then, but it was a killer.
Yeah, that's what it was. It was a killer.
Yeah, let's talk about the book. And their old saying is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Ed, the men who set up the Federal Reserve weren't friends of each other, and in fact, they probably considered several in attendance at Jekyll Island as their enemy. So how is it that they came together like individual mafia banking godfathers of different crime families to put together the Federal Reserve? How did it come about? What was who arranged this?
Well, it was arranged by the chieftains themselves, because what was happening, that was at the point in history, remember this was about 1910 that meeting took place, and for a few years prior to that, probably a good decade prior to that or more, there was the realization that the entire economic life of the nation was becoming more and more concentrated into the hands of a few very powerful financial institutions. We're talking about Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan primarily and their associates. And so there was a lot of competition, as you say, and they didn't like each other. They distrusted each other. But this was the period in history what some historians call the dawning of the cartel. And it was a period where the giants of industry, we're talking about the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, people like that, were coming to the realization that now that they were on top of the mountain, they didn't want anyone else climbing up the mountain. And they became very preoccupied with the question of how do we prevent competition now? Now that we competed and won the competition and we're in charge, we're running everything, we've got all these people at the bottom of this mountain and they're getting ready to climb that hill, and heck, they might knock us off. So they started to think of how they could combine, how they could create monopolies. A lot of monopolies came into existence. They were trying to destroy each other. If they couldn't destroy each other, they would form partnerships and they would go into business together. They would try and buy each other out. The whole idea was to eliminate competition. And incidentally, a little side issue on that is reading that part of the history, I couldn't believe that these very, very wealthy captains of industry, some of them, the wealthiest people in the world, were very admirably impressed by people like Karl Marx. I thought, well, what is that all about? Because they had a lot of money, I assumed that they were capitalists. And that's what we're told. If you have a lot of money, you're a capitalist. Well, no, I discovered that's not the case. Some of the richest people in the world are anti-capitalists. I mean, the Marxists in the world are the richest people because they have charge of the nation's money supply. I mean, they don't earn it through competition. They earn it through political power. And so that was an awakening to me to realize that these very, very wealthy people were not capitalists at all. There's the name for them is they were collectivists, and they had a lot in common with people like Karl Marx and Lenin and Mao Zedong, and even today you see that. I mean, I'm getting off on a sidetrack, but anyway, so I was looking at all that development, and it is a period where these captains of industry were deciding we want to eliminate competition. John D. Rockefeller is quoted by all of his biographers as saying, competition is a sin. And he made it sound like he was a humanitarian and he wanted to improve society by eliminating competition. But in reality, he just meant he wanted to remove his competition, and so he could remain at the pinnacle of control. So the way to do that is to form, either to create a monopoly. If you can't beat your opponents, then you form a partnership with them. And when you create a business arrangement with several competitors, that's called a cartel. And so a cartel was not new, but it was really coming into its own at that time in history when the Federal Reserve was created. So the idea was that these guys got together and said, okay, look, we're competitors, but now the public is on to us. There was a big hue and cry at the end of that century to break the grip of the money trust. That was a phrase that I kept coming across over and over again when I was doing research for this. You know, in the old newspapers, there were editorials. Quite often they'd be headed with slogans like "break the grip of the money trust," and some politicians were running their political campaigns on that kind of a slogan. Woodrow Wilson was one of them. Of course, he was working for the money trust, but he and the money trust decided that the best way to get him elected and into power is to let it be thought that he was an opponent. So they were playing that game. But break the grip of the money trust, that was the big hue and cry at the time. And that simply, they knew that something was going to happen. Congress was going to pass a law that was going to break the grip of the money trust. Well, they could sloganize all they want to, but they didn't want that to happen. They could say they wanted that to happen in order to get influence, in order to get votes and that kind of thing. But that's the last thing in the world that they really wanted. What they really wanted was to be put in charge to prevent breaking the grip of the money trust. And so the bankers essentially got together and said, look, somebody's going to write a law to control us and to reduce our influence in the economy. And we can't just sit back and let that happen. No, of course not. So we have to pretend that we are in the forefront of this movement to break the grip of the money trust. And we will write the law that supposedly is going to do that. Well, you can't just do that out in the open, so that's why they all retreated to Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia back in 1910 and had that famous secret meeting. Well, famous now, but at the time, of course, it was a secret meeting. And so these competitors got together, and they sat around a table in Jekyll Island at a very fancy club there called the Jekyll Island Club. And for 10 days, they hammered out the details of their cartel that they wanted to create. They were going to say, we're not going to compete anymore. We're going to get together. We're going to agree on interest rates and marketing practices and banking practices, and we're just going to determine how we create money out of nothing and what the ratios will be. We will be in charge, but we'll pretend like it's a bill to break the grip of the money trust. So they drafted their cartel agreement at that meeting, and then they went back to Washington. These were they went to Washington mostly as lobbyists. There were a couple of people in that group that were really political figures. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep into the details. Senator Nelson Aldrich was the primary one. And so they took this cartel agreement back to Washington, D.C., and if you can imagine a huge eraser, and they'd erase off of the top of the page the words that said cartel agreement, banking cartel agreement. Erase that off, and then in place write in the words Federal Reserve Act. And then they presented it to Congress and said, this is going to break the grip of the money trust, and all the idiots voted for it, and that's how we got the Federal Reserve System. Now, that's my sort of grade school explanation of how this thing came about and what it really was. But in spite of the oversimplification, and there's a lot of it, of course, but in spite of that, it's a very accurate representation of exactly what happened.
Ed, one of the delights of growing up in the 50s and 60s, I think you were in the Army at that time, is we were all led to believe that things weren't rigged, that everybody had a fair shot at knowing right from wrong and truth from lies, and that in the end, we were still all Americans pulling for the United States, and we were pulling together. Now in later years, we realize that the reality is far from that, and that there are always those that deceived us as they sought an unfair advantage, as you say, to legalize the theft of public wealth. Now, Ed, I'm glad that you don't shy away from conspiracy, But I guess one of the first questions is, how has it been that the truth of what took place at Jekyll Island has always been hid up until your book? That was, 1994. Up until that point, it's been hidden from us as Americans. How'd they pull that off?
Well, that's it's not an easy question to answer unless you back far enough away from the picture and you don't get too bogged down in the details. If you back way, way back and you look at the outlines, it's pretty simple. First of all, the general public really doesn't care. They just think, well, the money system, that's too complicated for me. As long as it's being taken care of by those people in Washington, and I vote for the people in Washington, so I know since I vote for them that they got to be, they're there to help me. So I don't care what they come up with, and they just sort of trust the system, and they're encouraged to do that, So that's a big chunk. But most people don't care, and if they do care, they start to look at it. They're confronted by a sort of a blizzard of technical terms, banking terminology and political terminology, and I think, oh my gosh, I got to go to college to figure this one out. So then, I got other things to do. I'm a carpenter, or I make shoes, or I'm a salesman, or something. I guess I have to leave this to the bankers. Again, they fall back on the assumption that, well, we can trust the system because it's in the hands of the political leaders that we elect, and so therefore it's okay. So that's part of it. And then the other part of it is, and this is hard for the average person to believe, is that at the very top of these structures, there are people who want to keep it that way. They do not want us to understand, because if enough of us do understand and begin to do what we're doing right here on this program, get the word out, and start to explain it and rouse the rabble, so to speak, and let the average person know that, hey, they're being taken for a fool, well, then it's going to lead to some kind of a real change. We really are going to break the grip of the money trust, and we can't let that happen. So they would do everything possible to prevent people like us from getting the word out. And so they try to make us look like fools. They call us conspiracy theorists. They call us idiots. They say if they can't find anything on us, if they can't find any real dirt on our lives, or they'll go create something, totally make it up, but they'll get it into the press, and people will read it. And they'll say, oh, listen to this. Why, this guy that wrote the book that we like so much, why he beats his wife every Thursday night. And he seemed like such a nice person. They believe anything they read in the press. And that leads to the reality that the banking system and all the financial interests have a very powerful voice in controlling the press. And they made that a part of their strategy, actually, decades ago, that they had to gain control over the press, which means control over what people are allowed to hear and what they think. So all of those factors come together, and so you realize that the chances of getting a fair description of what I just talked about a moment ago, getting that into the schools or into the media, onto any of the networks or into the major newspapers, is practically zero. And so that's how it happens. It's control, it's apathy and control, a combination of those two things.
You've always maintained that the Federal Reserve promotes and makes money on wars around the world. So I'm not going to push you too hard, but can you give the listeners the Reader's Digest version of the relationship between the Federal Reserve System and the war machine? And then, if you could, what do you think of the current U.S. foreign policy and the industrial military complex? So tie the reserve and the war machine together, if you could.
Okay. Well, let's see how good a knot I can tie on that one. It's a big topic, and starting back again to the issue that people don't want to believe these things. They just think that, oh, that couldn't be true, that there's an industrial military complex that is using wars, actually desiring wars, facilitating wars, creating wars that are needless, and not only needless, but horrible in every sense. They're counterproductive, that they're doing that deliberately so that they can make a buck. Oh, no, that can't be true, because we go back again to the issue. Well, no, the people we elected to Congress wouldn't allow that. What they don't realize is that there's so much money in war, the creation of war machinery and ammunition and the weapons of destruction. There's so much money in that industry that the overflow can easily be shifted into politics, and the large war manufacturing companies that make the ammunition and all the weapons of war have such huge profits that they can buy politicians. They buy politicians with such generous donations to their campaigns, and that they can count that those politicians will always vote the way they want them to vote. They'll always increase the war budget, and they'll always perpetuate the line that, oh my gosh, we have a terrible enemy, and we must defend America. So if you don't vote for this $1 trillion increase in the military budget, why, that means you're an enemy of America, because look, we're weakening our defenses, and look, we have this horrible enemy here and another horrible enemy there, and look at this terrorist activity here, and oh my gosh, do you care about your children and your families? Don't you care about your country? You know, it's a game. It's a vicious game, and most people lose that game because they don't know it's a game. They really take it for real, and so I'm sort of wandering around, bouncing on the topic. All of these things are at play. There are people at the top, and this is always the issue. We must understand there's a huge gap between that very small group at the pinnacle of power that really benefit from all this. There's a huge gap between that and the masses of us down below who want to believe that everything is fine. We want to trust these people at the highest levels. We want to believe that what they tell us is true. And of course, when they tell it to us, they have control over the media, and it comes in a very convincing form with photographs and interviews and videos and sound effects, and everybody's saying the same thing, so it must be true. So we believe all of this, and that's why it can continue. And so you get down to the bottom line: is how do they finance all of these wars? They're terribly expensive. I don't remember the percentages, but I think if we had an accountant firm that could really add up all the financial costs of war, not the human costs, but just the financial costs to the American people, of how much it costs to maintain this military-industrial complex that we're talking about, I'm going to just guess that it's probably about a third, if not 45% of everything we produce. I think that's where it can't be far off from that if we put all of the costs together into the same bag. Now, that's a huge drain on the American economy, on the productive power of the American people, and a huge drain on their savings, their ability to keep what they earn, and to prepare for their security in their old age, their retirement. And of course, inflation is raging along, which means that even the money they save for their retirement, by the time they get to retirement, the money doesn't buy anything anymore. So they get that too. And so they get just about everything that the American people produce. At the end of their lifetime, there's really not much left, except for a very small group of very fortunate people. So now, how do they get that money from the American people? If they were, in the old days, before a Federal Reserve, or the thing they call central banks, which all countries have them, they're called central banks. Our central bank is called the Federal Reserve System, and they all do the same thing. They create money out of debt, and they push money into circulation. That expands the money supply, which decreases the purchasing power of each individual currency unit, so that the average bloke like you and me, we buy less and less with our currency. So that's how the inflation thing works. But in the days before that, how could the emperors of old days and the dictators of old days finance their wars? Well, they had to go and collect taxes. Had to send the tax man around and say, well, we want more taxes this year, more taxes next year, and more again the next year. Well, historically what happens is it seems that when the taxes of a nation begin to climb above 35, 40%, there's always a tax revolt of some kind. And the leaders of the tyranny and the warmongers, they get knocked off. They're replaced. So in the old days, it was always a sort of an unspoken rule that you cannot tax your citizens more than about 40% of everything they earn, and sometimes a lot less than that will cause them to rebel. And of course, once the people rebel, the game is kind of over. So the trick was, how do you get more than 40% out of the people and still keep your power? and not have to worry about the people rebelling. And that's why the central banks became so popular, because they figured out that they can tax the people through inflation. And they won't even know that they're paying the tax. They'll say, inflation, what the heck is causing that? Isn't that a shame? They think inflation comes from the sky or something. They do not understand that inflation is just a hidden tax. And so that's how they can finance these wars. So you take away the central bank mechanism, and you force governments to go to their people and say, we've got a serious enemy, a serious threat, and we need taxes for this, and this is what it's going to cost you. They would have to really justify. They'd have to be for real. They'd have to prove that, that there is an enemy, or that we really need to sacrifice 8 million American soldiers to protect the oil interests of some country in the Middle East or something like that. It'd be pretty hard to sell if people knew that they were paying taxes and also paying with the lives of their sons for those things. So the short answer to your question is that the relationship between the Federal Reserve and all other central banks is that it is a mechanism by which industrial and war industrial complexes all over the world, not just the United States, but other countries as well, it's that how they can get this unlimited money supply from the people without the people knowing that they're paying it and not having any control over whether they pay it or not. So it's an easy payment system.
I want to go right to the heart of it. What do you think it's going to do? What'll it take to get rid of our Federal Reserve banking system? And you can tie it in your answer, and will getting rid of the Federal Reserve destroy our economy? And for goodness sakes, do you think we can ever get back on a gold standard for our money, Ed?
Well, help me remember the first part is
all right.
How we do it. But
how do we get rid of the Federal Reserve? And if we do that, are we going to destroy our economy?
Yeah. And, well, first of all, can we do it? Of course we can do it. And if we don't do it, we go down the tubes. It's we either abolish the Federal Reserve or the Federal Reserve will abolish America. That's my conclusion, because it's a plunder scheme. It's a complete it's organized crime that's gotten control of the government, and they're just plundering us. That's it. And they keep increasing it. They have an insatiable appetite. Every year they want more and more, and they get more and more. And you can't go on forever with that. They want it all. And that's really the end game, is when they get it all, then we're through. That's it. We're just slaves. We've returned back to Egypt, and we're slaves. And the Pharaoh is in charge, and we work in the straw pits. That's where we're headed. So it has to be done. The question is, how can you do it? And the answer is, it's easy and it's not so easy. The easy part is we know how to do it. We just reverse the process by which the Federal Reserve was created, and that's simply to get Congress to say we hereby abolish the Federal Reserve. Congress created it. Congress has the power right now to abolish it. So it's easy. How do we do it? We just get Congress to say we abolish the Federal Reserve. But now, how do we get Congress to do that when most of the congressmen are beholden in one way or another to the system itself? They're beholden because a lot of them have close business ties with interests that are part of this matrix. And secondly, they know if they start speaking against the Federal Reserve, not just speaking against it like President Trump says, this Federal Reserve needs to be knocked down, but actually doing something about it. They start voting for something that would reduce the power of the Fed, actually do that. Why? They know that they would be knocked out of office because the Federal Reserve and that financial interest control the mass media. So the mass media would turn on the person so viciously that they would convince the public that this person was insane, or that he was criminal, or worse, or something. Or, of course, they could get rid of him. There are plenty of jackals out there that can be hired to get rid of people, and that happens periodically, as we know. So getting rid of it is simple, but how do you actually convince enough congressmen to take the stance to do so. Now, that's the hard part. Well, I say it's hard. That, too, is simple, but it's still hard. And that is that we have to reach out to the American people and get the awareness of this problem so universally spread out that everybody demands it. And if enough people really understand the problem we're facing, there will be political figures that will come from the outside of the establishment, not from inside. It won't be anybody we've ever heard of before. It'll be somebody just stepping up to the plate who's been a school teacher, or maybe, gosh, only knows, maybe a writer, maybe a talk show host, maybe somebody that just decided to make a difference in the world. Who knows? But somebody who has no axe to grind and no commitments to the establishment, and is willing to surrender all of the glories and the offers and the enticements that can be offered to a political figure, and also is smart enough to stay out of being entrapped so that it can't be blackmailed. All of these things can be done if a person is informed and they know who their enemy is. That will come. It'll come eventually that way. It won't be under the present system, however, because right now the average American doesn't care. Right now the average American doesn't know. And right now the average American doesn't see or believe that he has the ability to do anything about it anyway. So all of those things have to be overcome. And that's the reason that we created an organization called Freedom Force International, which I know we don't have time to talk about now, but it's made up of a group of people around the world who face this same problem in other countries as well, who are determined to bring about exactly what I have described.
Ed, you've got this book now published in Chinese, German, and Japanese, and go ahead and let's talk about Freedom Force International just for a second. Then I want to get back to a couple conspiracies, but this is pretty important stuff. Freedom Force International is that's bellwether stuff. I love hearing about that.
Oh, well, I'm glad that you know about it. Yeah, because we do need a force. How do I approach this topic? So many things flood across my mind at the same time. Some people say, well, Mr. Griffin, what can an average person do against such a powerful force as this? What can the average person do? And my response is, well, stop being average, The average person can't do anything about it because the average person doesn't want to do anything about it. The average person doesn't think he can do anything about it. The average person won't stick his neck out. He doesn't have a stomach for conflict, controversy. He wants to be loved by everybody. He's afraid somebody will call him a bad name. He doesn't want to risk pleasing his employer. He doesn't want to lose his job. The average person is a timid soul he can't do anything about it. He's easy to capture. So, fortunately, history has always been written not by the average people, but by the unaverage people. So the way to do something is to stop being average and to step forward and become courageous and become a leader and be willing to take on your opposition and face conflict. And
on a grassroots level, Ed, we're beginning to see it. The problem is when they get to Washington. In fact, one of the questions is, do they all have the same master? One of my buddies, Dave, said many of us have awakened to the fact that there's very little difference in politicians in the two-party system once they get to Washington, D.C. Do they all have the same master once they get there, Ed?
I'm thinking about that. I think that they have the same. They all face the same kind of a master, and I think even above the masters, there is a single master. Okay, so in that sense, yes, but each one is vulnerable in a different way. Some people just have this passion for fame and wealth. That's their master, and the master that controls them is the person or group that provides them fame and wealth. Okay, there are other people who have, let's say, sexual preferences that most of us would be horrified to even think about. Our opponents love to put those kinds of people into power because they have the goods on them and they can blackmail them. They can say, well, you step out, you do this, or we will not only ruin your reputation and you lose all of these wonderful benefits that you now have, but you will be ruined for life. In fact, we might even put you in prison. somebody like Weinstein, for example. We'll put you in prison. And who knows, you might even be suicided in prison. But there are different ways of mastering people who like to go into politics because they enjoy politics. We need people that go into politics because they hate politics. And they don't go in there for their own personal gain. They go there to make a difference to the system and to change the system. But back to your question, yes, I think it's basically the same master. It's hard to put a name as to what that master is. But I think these people themselves have given themselves their own name. They all speak fondly of what they call the New World Order. That's their name. It's not our name. And they all speak, when they get kind of a misty look in their eye when they say, the New World Order is coming to be. They just dream and drool about the New World Order, which to them, maybe they have different visions, but basically it means that it's a world that they control, and that a world in which 99.9% of the population serves them unquestionably and without question. Without limitation, I should say, and they have they're on top, they're in control, and everybody else serves them, master and slave, and they do it so, and they get everybody to go along with it by convincing them that the slaves are now convinced that this is for their own best interest, for their own good. So that's the trick, and I don't know if we want to call them anything. I guess I just call them the New World Orders. Those people.
Hey, Ed, this is Bill Holter. I've got a quick question for you, talking about the end of ending the Federal Reserve. At this point, we're basically there's more debt outstanding than can ever be repaid.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to repay it, obviously they've got to push, create more debt, push more currency into the system. It destroys the dollar itself. Is that a way, the Fed destroying itself? Did you see the Fed going away, or do you believe rather that it's going to be man-made, where they get shut off by Congress or whatever?
Well, that depends on us to a large degree. It depends on how aggressive we are, how successful we are, because they're not going to be shut off by Congress unless we and our method and our message is out there. So, but take that out of the equation. If everything continues exactly as it is, well, yeah, the whole thing just implodes. So you're quite right. There's no way to repay that debt, and they know that. That's why they're so anxious to go into debt. They know they don't have to repay it, or they cannot. They never will. We'll repay it because the system will collapse. The dollar will buy nothing anymore. And so we were expecting to be repaid. Oh, I'm going to get $50,000. Oh, when you get $50,000, you can't buy a postage stamp with it. Right. So that's how it's repaid. And they know that. So that's why they don't hesitate anymore.
Do you think they knew that back in 1913 when it first started? Do you think they knew from a credit standpoint that they would end up blowing up the currency?
I believe they had to. I think that the people that created the system, and remember, this system was imported from Europe. It really was borrowed almost exactly from the Bank of England. The Rothschilds were dominant over the Bank of England. They were probably the leading figures in creating the central bank concept. They understood it very well. But no, does that mean that even all the bankers within the system understood it? I'm not sure about that. I doubt it. I think most people within the system were good people, and they would never have willingly participated in a system that they knew would end up in the destruction of so many lives and of the system itself, of the country, of the nation, the community, the world. I don't think they would have done it. But at the very, very top, and here we go again, at that extremely small number at the top, they must have known it. Heck, if a guy like me from University of Michigan, who never took an economic course in his life, except Economics 101 or something like that, if I can understand it, you know that these masters who put it together understood it very well.
Ed, I'm going to pivot just a bit because we've got a friend that wants to know your thoughts about Julian Assange. Is he a key to the deep state puzzle, or is he just a distraction who will never be allowed to testify to the secrets he knows? What's your take on Julian Assange?
Well, that's an interesting question. I haven't even thought about my take on Julian Assange. I've always taken him at what he appears to be. And to me, at least, he appears to be somebody that stumbled into something and was outraged and did his best to get the truth out, got slapped down, went into hiding, and I guess they're going to drag him behind the tractor or something. I've always accepted that he was exactly what he appeared to be. I'm very suspicious about false leadership in this game, because I do know from seeing how these people who created the Federal Reserve actually created their own opposition so they could control their opposition. And I realized, oh my gosh, what a brilliant tactic that is. And then since then, I've seen it show up everywhere I look. Quite often, the leader of the people that we'd like to have faith in, because they're saying all the right things, actually are put there by our opponents to be our leaders so that we cannot win. At the very end, it buckles. They lose, because that's why they're there. They're there to be our leaders, but not to allow us to win. And so I'm very suspicious of that. And I see it a lot when a lot of people would question it. But nevertheless, with Julian Assange, I don't see it there. It might be there, I don't know. So I guess my answer is I think he is what he appears to be.
Ed, the gold price has been suppressed for decades now. Do you believe that this was, I always feel safe using the word conspiracy with a guy like you, Ed. Thank you. Always before when I'm in a conversation, if I say the word conspiracy, I see everybody's pucker string pull up tight. But with you, I think I'm safe. Do you believe that the elite families of the world have acquired gold during this period of suppression of gold prices? Was that the reason that they kept it suppressed?
Well, that's two parts to that question. Yes, they have acquired large amounts of gold. In fact, a lot of the central banks that we're talking about have also acquired huge stockpiles of gold, and they all want gold. Now, at the same time that they are wanting gold and amassing as much of it as they can get their hands on, they're telling everybody else out, oh, gold is worthless. We don't want gold. You get rid of that stuff. That's worthless. They don't want us to have it. And that right there is kind of a tip as to there's some kind of a game going on here, and we're not supposed to win this game. Anyway, and so it leads to the question of why would they want gold, but they don't want us to have it, and they don't want gold to back the currency? Well, it's pretty simple when you realize that the banks, of course, are in charge of all of this part of the puzzle. The banks make their money from interest on loans. So that means interest of money. Banks need money. They need an inventory to loan. Well, if you and I were a bank and all we had was $10,000 worth of gold money in our vault, that's all we could loan. And boy, trying to make a killing on interest on $10,000 loan is kind of hard. I mean, we better go into a different business. So what we need a lot more than $10,000 to loan. And we don't want to depend on the people holding gold to come into the bank and say, okay, we're going to deposit our gold into your bank, and now you can loan this money out and earn interest on it. Because that's too slow. It's too limiting. They want unlimited amounts of money that they can loan. I mean unlimited. The only way to do that is to break it away from gold or anything else that would limit the supply. They need something that they can create themselves out of nothing. And no restriction. And so that's what the whole game is with the central banks, is to legalize this act of being able to make money based on nothing except the credit of the borrower. So they create it out of nothing except whatever assets or credit the borrower has. So they're really, the borrower is the source of the money. And it's kind of an interesting idea once you get your head around it. So the banks do not want gold or anything else in the money supply, because that would limit the quantity of their inventory of loans. It would severely limit the amount of interest they could earn. So that's, in a nutshell, is why they don't want money behind them. I mean, gold behind the money system, but they love gold themselves because they know that their system they created is destroying the purchasing power of those paper dollars. But the gold, in terms of its purchasing power, is maintaining itself very well, thank you. Now, there was another part to your question which I don't recall now. What was the other part to that?
Just the whole idea of suppression. Are they suppressing it for their own benefit for acquisition? And I think you answered that very cleanly.
Well, yeah, and the other part of that is that they suppress the price of gold because if they allowed gold to seek its normal value in a free market, that would show up. It would become a measure by which to gauge the value of all other currencies. And then we really would see how much inflation really there was. And they don't want that because they want people to keep their confidence in the U.S. dollar or the Deutschmark or the yen. They want them to say, well, yeah, I know there's inflation out there. I don't know quite what it is, but they tell us it's 3% or something. I guess it seems more like that. Seems more than that to me, But they don't want people to know what the real rate of inflation is because then they would become dissatisfied with the system. So by suppressing gold, the price of gold, it eliminates from easy view, at least from the average person's view, it eliminates any means by which they can truly gauge the means by which the level to which their money is being depreciated. So that's another reason they don't want that comparison out there.
There are rumors that the Chinese have the largest hoard of gold ever. Do you believe the Chinese will, going back to the enemy of my enemy is my friend, if they are trying to get rid of the United States, what better way than to blow up their currency now that we're off the petrodollar, or soon to be? Do you believe the Chinese will use their gold stash to establish a gold peg, maybe?
Well, I'm thinking about that. I don't know. I'll be totally honest with you. I don't understand all of the aspects of the Chinese strategy on gold, but some of it I do. First of all, we know that China, let me put it that way, that China has never abandoned its ancient creed, is that America is enemy number one. The leaders of China, I believe, deep in their heart, are looking forward to the day or the age where America will be on its knees and serving them as the masters. There's no doubt in my mind, and they still write books and essays and give speeches on that topic today. So we also know that the Chinese are not particularly interested in serving the best interests of the people of the world or even the Chinese people. It's like in most countries, there's that hierarchy. That's what it's all about. In their case, it's the Communist Party and the communists and the ruling class. That's what they serve. And so, if they're hoarding gold, they're not doing it because they want to make a wonderful economy for the Chinese people. It's because they want it as a means of acquiring political power and global power for the Chinese hierarchy. I am convinced that what the Chinese are hoping to do is to make the Chinese yen the primary currency in the world, just like the U.S. dollar has been for so long, which will give them tremendous political clout if they can bring that about. And if the only way they can bring that about is to back their currency by gold or a portion of it, they're perfectly willing to do that because that's what they want. They want that currency to be the master currency of the world. So having achieved that goal, if they can do it that way, that doesn't mean they have to keep the gold behind the currency forever. It just means it's like a demo. I mean, this is how we'll make it work for now, but later on, we don't have to keep it that way. Once we're in the saddle, well, then we're in the saddle like the U.S. is. And I think that they would definitely not keep gold behind their currency for very long, or at least at a substantial ratio, because being able to expand the currency through inflation is so politically powerful that I can only imagine that it would have to be statesmen like Jefferson and Madison and Washington and people like that who would consciously forego personal power and leverage for the benefit of the nation or for mankind. Not many people in that category, and at least not today. I don't see many of them anywhere in any country, and especially not in China.
Ed, I've only got one more question. I promised you we'd try to keep this to an hour, but it's going to pull on all of your experience. I remember your very passionate speeches about individualism versus collectivism. I read a piece by Walter Williams last week about intolerance, specifically intolerance in academia, and it's no longer a free exchange of ideas, and I believe Williams made pretty good observation that colleges and institutions are rigging the debate by brainwashing students into collectivism where there's only one perspective, and that's the perspective of the group or the state. It's no longer about academic pursuit of truth, but Ed, is that not the perfect description of what has happened in public debate about everything from 9/11 to the Federal Reserve to global warming to gold as a barbarous relic? God bless you for getting this group back together. I am so excited to know that this Freedom Force International is going to address this. But give me your thoughts about individualism versus collectivism as far as the brainwashing that's been taking place.
Well, yes, I think you're right on target. The main intellectual current of all of the debates and, in fact, I'll say all of the communication systems in the world. I was going to say just America, but I think in the world for the past 100 years has been to eliminate this concept of individualism and replace it, to whatever extent it did exist, with the concept of collectivism, because that is the essence of what these New World Order people want. They want total control, and they don't want to have to subdue the people by military means to maintain that control. They want the people to control themselves, which means they have to control their minds, and they have to convince them that no matter what the hardship, no matter what the penalty, that it's somehow in their best interest to conform. And that's really the trick behind collectivism, is to convince the slaves that this is for their best interest, that it's good that they're slaves, that any other system where they're not slaves would just be terrible because it would lead to chaos, it would lead to wars and things like that. Who knows? Anyway, slavery is good compared to the images that are presented to people of the world of things that they must fear so much that they're willing to give up their freedom. By that I mean slavery doesn't sound so bad when you think about the world collapsing in atomic war. So if we want to eliminate the possibility of an atomic war, well, we have to give up our freedom, right? That's a good trade. Or if we don't want terrorism, well, we have to give up our freedom, right? Oh, we don't want drugs. Oh, terrible drug epidemic. Well, yeah, but we have to give up our freedom. We don't want child pornography, do we? No, even if we have to give up our freedom. Everything is presented to us as a horrible specter, and that's part of the trick, to convince everybody that giving up a little bit of your freedom here and a little bit more there and paying more of your assets here until finally you have nothing left and you're dependent on the state, you have no assets left. It's all a good trade so that we're protected against these horrible specters. And so it's in our own best interest, we're told, to do all of these things. So that's the trick, and that's been going on for 100 years, and it's certainly in the final stages right now, to the point where it's openly taught and advocated at the university level, as you suggested. And it's pretty well done. I think the students going through the universities today, I don't know what the ratio is, but I'm going to guess that it's probably 70% of them are buying into it. Now, when I went through school back in the 50s, there was a lot of it then. I didn't know what it was at the time. Looking back in retrospect, I realized that they were teaching collectivism, the greater good for the greater number concept. And I was buying into it, but fortunately I wasn't particularly interested in political science or sociology or anything like that. I was I had other things on my mind. But even then, and it was only in its weakest form, it was obvious. Today, it's total. Anybody's on campus today at most state-financed universities, if they even said what I just said now, they would be kicked out. They would be banished. They wouldn't be allowed to teach. They probably wouldn't even be allowed to attend school as a student. So it's gotten to the point of such complete control over opinion, over the thought process, that I think it's worse than it was in the Soviet Union. I think we have progressed further toward collectivism in America now, and in terms of that aspect of it, control over the thinking process, than even the Soviet Union had. But how many Americans know either one? How many Americans even know what the Soviet Union was, for God's sake? And how would they compare what's happening in the United States to the way it was, say, 100 years ago, when all of our history has been expunged from our history books, and you're not even allowed to teach American history? So that's the game. Control your slaves by controlling their thought processes, and that.
Did I lose you, Ed? Well, how about that? You were listening to the very wonderful G. Edward Griffin, who joined us today on the JS Mindset website. He's the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's now in its 42nd printing. It's available at virtually every bookstore across America. And really, just to honor Ed, I've got to tell you that this Freedom Force International...
There he is. He's back.
Ed, you back?
No, that's me who's back. I got kicked off this call 4 times.
David, let me just add that a lot of the stuff I heard from G. Edward Griffin was
could have come out of my mouth.
It was the Mr. Rogers version instead of the Attila the Hun version that I get from Dave every week. But just what a wonderful interview. I wanted to tell everybody who's listening, freedomforceinternational.org. freedomforceinternational.org, and I think we'll reach out to Harriet to see if we can get a link put up so people can explore that. But boys, that was a wonderful sharing of an hour with a man who has fought the good fight, won't you think?
It was excellent.
All I could tell you is I was given his book in 1996 by a customer of mine, and I told Bill the whole story, but it set me on the path. It finally, I had always been a counter thinker, and I always knew they were setting us up to be screwed. I just wasn't exactly sure how. His book exactly laid out the roadmap, and I've spent the last 25 years running down this rabbit hole, 23 years running down this rabbit hole, and it gets deeper every day because the things that he's taught me combined with what Jim and Bill have taught me, with my healthy skepticism of the military-industrial complex, having growing up in it, it's like, the banks of the military-industrial complex win every single time, do they not?
They do. Listen, I want to tell everybody about this book. It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island. It is very thick, but there is a way to read this. There is a synopsis that you can read all at once, and you can read the summaries all at once. So there's an introduction synopsis, and then there's a summary synopsis. You can get through the whole thing in about an hour, and then it's fun to go back and see the drama for each and individual thing, like how the group came together, how they were told not to make eye contact with each other on the train, how they were to get to Jekyll Island. It's just a great story, but don't be intimidated by the thickness of the book, because there's a way to get through it. And then, Dave, it's fun to read after that because you can go back and just see what these scoundrels did. It's quite a treatise.
It's the banking mafia. It's not the concrete or ironworkers mafia. It's the bankers mafia. And, as he alluded to, see, this all leads back to one ruler. Everything's controlled opposition. They figured that out a long time ago. And that's why they set up the Federal Reserve. They had to make it look like they weren't screwing us. The two-party system is perfect for that because, like G. Edward Griffin says,
you have
it doesn't matter it doesn't matter what party you're in. the parties all answer to the military-industrial complex and the banks because they butter their bread. So either you play along or you're dead. I mean, it's not hard.
All right. So I think with that, we'll tell our listeners we are going to be back with you on Saturday, and we'll probably be talking about this. But we hope you enjoy this. Bill, you are going to post this privately on the...
I'm going to post this for subscribers for 24 hours, then we'll make
24 hours. Right.
We'll make it available to the public.
And since we don't, Dave and Jim and I don't have access, would you reach out to JB and tell him thanks for helping us get this one put together?
Yes, I'll do that.
That'd be great.
This was like the guys. G. Edward Griffin is a genius. Whether you agree with every single word he says, I do. And you know, he's not a conspiracy theorist, and he taught me I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a critical thinker. I actually could turn around in a crowd of 70,000 people walking this way and say, that's bullshit. I'm not going that way. And this is the Matrix. I've mentioned it. G. Edward Griffin mentioned it. It's a mental matrix.
I like the Mr. Rogers version better than the Attila the Hun version, though. I have to tell you, he's just got that nice Jonathan Winters voice.
Right.
You always sound like you're ready to kill me.
Well, but at the end of the day, what Bill's telling you, that we're dead because they have total control over this game.
I think I just heard Ed come in. Ed, we've been singing your praises for 5 minutes, hoping you'd come back so we could say thank you.
I've been sitting here taking notes. I heard the whole thing.
Oh, you heard the whole thing? Well, okay, I'm sorry I called you Mr. Rogers, but you're so demure compared to Crazy Dave now. So.
Well,
hey, listen.
Somebody mentioned the Matrix. Can we make a little plug here for the upcoming Red Pill Expo?
Oh, absolutely. They're in Nevada?
Yeah, in Mesquite, Nevada, November 8th and 9th, yeah.
And where do you find it? Now, we've already turned people to freedomforceinternational.org. Can you get things on that website for that one?
Actually, not yet. I probably should add something to it. Well, let me just make just a simple statement on it, and that is that almost everything we're talking about in one way or another it can be categorized as illusion versus reality. And so many aspects of our lives, and the most important aspects of our lives, we find that they're based on illusion. And the more we learn about them as we get older and the more we research, the more we come to the amazing conclusion we've been fooled all these years. So anyway, it cuts across so many different topics. We decided 3 years ago to put on something called the Red Pill Expo. And sort of, it's a takeoff on the meme that was created by the sci-fi movie The Matrix, and the whole idea, take the red pill, man, wake up, see life the way it really is. So we did a Red Pill Expo in Montana back in 2017. It was a runaway success. We've had 3 of them since then, and now we're doing the next one coming up on November 8th and 9th in Mesquite, Nevada, which is
2 weeks and 2 days away. Yeah, it's redpillexpo.org. Redpillexpo.org.
That's it. Look it up, and you can see all the speakers. I'll be speaking, of course. Naturally, you can't shut me up. But we have some really great speakers on the program. So look it up, and I hope to see you.
Ed, you're a gracious human being. Thank you for taking us back to school. We all needed this very, very much. And you've got some friends here at JS Mindset. We'll try to make you the hero that you belong, okay?
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. That is for sure. You are a hero.
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, you are my hero. Have a great night. Bye.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
All that. Thank you. Goodbye.
All right, sir. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.